Tomorrow's People, the podcast brought to you by Personio and me, Perry Timms. Everything starts with people. And a fascinating perspective on our busyness as people in work comes from our next guest, Megan Reitz. A renowned lecturer, author and speaker, Megan's work on spaciousness is only just underway, but we have the privilege of hearing what that's all about. Welcome to the Tomorrow's People podcast, Megan Reitz. Great to have you here.
Thank you. It's brilliant to be here with you, Perry.
So we've known each other for quite some time, and I've seen the kind of spaces that you occupy and the work that you do, both at Holt International Business School and on stage and in written form. What's capturing your attention? What are you focusing on right now?
I've just started, I call it a new research project, but it is very much evolving out of two big research projects that I've been running for the last decade. The new one is called Spaciousness.
Ooh.
So for the last decade, I've been running two research projects. One is called The Mindful Leader, and I'm interested in mindfulness. That's a word that means all sorts of things, but I'm particularly interested in habits of behavior, particularly leaders' habits. And if we are going to change any habits, we have to be aware in the moment when we're about to do what we've always done and make a different choice.
Ooh.
And that's the bit I'm really interested in. How do you create these little spaces where you see what you're about to do and you make wiser choices? So that's the kind of mindful leader. The other project is Speaking Truth to Power.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in conversational habits. In other words, what gets said, what gets talked about, and what doesn't.
Ooh.
And whose voices do we habitually listen to, and whose voices do we habitually not listen to?
Wow.
What are the consequences and how do you disrupt it? So spaciousness now is about how do we create spaces where we can pause, where we can listen, where we can speak and make wiser choices inside organizational systems that I don't know about you, Perry, but to me, they seem pathologically busy.
Yeah.
So how do we create spaces when the systems that we're situated in are busy squeezing them out left, right and center? That's what I'm obsessed with. Yeah. I'm obsessed with it for myself in terms of how do I create space to even do a research project on space, and how do others? So that's really exciting. I'm just kicking it off now.
And you got me. So pathologically busy is a phrase I've now banked and will use because that is just the relentlessness of it. It is the badge of honor and the warrior spirit. And it's almost like, what are we doing? And we are squeezing out consciousness and depth and patience. And as a result, a bit of grace and elegance has gone. It's all brutal and absolutely sort of focused on getting there as quickly as possible. And it's almost like, but is there where you need to be, right?
Well, at the moment, there is absolutely not where we need to be. So we're heading on a fairly catastrophic pathway, and yet we don't have the space and time to just pause and see where we're heading. So that's the very serious bit behind why we've worked on speaking up. We've worked on activism. We're now working on spaciousness. It's like how do we stop this this train heading in this direction? Because it's having some fairly disastrous results already, and it's going to have some more. Not to sound too much of a doomsdayer here, but we do need to wake up to it.
Well, completely right. And it does feel like your bank of work has evolved and almost iterated upon each other and taken on a different dimension. And I know a couple of the things that you're probably talking to there about disaster are to do with things like the human energy and wellness crises that I guess we're in, because burnout is both pronounced, stubbornly high, not going down, more prevalent, more damaging. And then the other one really is the burning planet, I suppose. It's burnout and burning planet. Those are two that really occur to me, and I guess they feature heavily in your thinking.
They do. And social inequity as well would be the other one that we've really looked at in terms of activism. Again, whose voices aren't getting heard, whose voices are getting heard, and how do we rebalance that in order that we tackle some of these issues around climate around stress. I'm very interested in the relational aspect of how we work at work. And the increasing, a colleague of mine and a very good friend called Alison Reynolds refers to the tyranny of the tangible. And in our workplaces, again, we are very focused on instrumental work, on short-term tangible targets. We seem to be getting more and more obsessed by that. And of course, that squeezes out the spaces where we can relate and see one another as human beings. And that, again, squeezes out our potential to feel fulfilled at work, as well as make empathic relational choices and see ourselves as a wider system rather than as sort of individuals and fragmented away from that system.
It does feel like just at the time we need to be more thoughtful, we are encouraged, if not almost yearning for less of it because of that relentlessness. We gauge success not by have I got the time to think about this, but have I ticked it all off and can I then collapse in a heap at the end of the day?
Yeah.
It's not a particularly flourishing way to be, is it?
Not at all. Not at all. But, again, how do you change habits when you're in systems that are quite tightly focused on a particular thing? That's, again, another reason why I'm interested in leadership, because people in positions of power might be slightly more able to start and shift and change systems that we're situated in. But I'm interested in, how do we raise our voices? How do we listen in to those voices when they're raised?
Because I just had a thought in my mind about the whole concept of organisational listening, because bizarrely, I kind of hear that more now. People saying, we're having some listening exercises, they're saying. I'm like, oh, wow, that sounds quite novel then for you to name it and give it that much kind of distinction. So do you think that's a fabulous thing that we've got listening being programmed, or is it a bit of a fad where we're like, we better do this because the survey wasn't good enough and we need to show up? I mean, is it theatre or is it genuine?
I think it's a bit of both. So again, I've been exploring speaking truth to power for about 10 years. And just a quick story that I often tell. Right at the beginning of my research, a leader tapped me on the shoulder and said to me, Megan, we've got a bit of an issue with some people over there. I think pointing at middle managers,
Right.
They're usually the ones that get pointed at. Those middle managers really need to speak up more. We need ideas. We need to know when there's been mistakes. Could you just kind of go and make them speak up? And
Wow.
off I went, and I spoke to they.
Yeah.
And the first quote in my research that I collected was straight from they. And they said, true story, last time somebody spoke up round here, they disappeared.
Oh, dear.
And so one of the biggest mistakes we make in organisational systems and in work on psychological safety, which of course is huge right now, is we look at the people that aren't speaking up and then we try and fix them.
Yeah.
And it is just, I think the penny is just dropping that actually how we show up as leaders affects those voices.
Yeah.
So if we show up in a certain way, then their voices will never be spoken. And so rather than fixing we have to create a culture of listening. Now, at this stage in my work, I get lots of people nodding their head and going, yeah, absolutely, organisational listening, we're on it.
Yeah.
Now, two big problems
Right.
that I would then say with organisational listening, at least, that will lead me to probably a response on whether it's a fad or not.
Yeah.
One is that most leaders and managers at that point will nod their head and they'll go, Megan, I completely agree. Listening's really, really important. And in their head, they'll go, luckily, I'm already really good at it.
Exactly right.
It's just all my colleagues, frankly. My colleagues, they're a bit rubbish. Definitely need to work. I hope they're listening. I hope they're listening to this podcast or whatever. And it's really funny because we all overestimate our capacity for listening. And of course, what that results in is absolutely no change whatsoever because we all sit there and we wait for everybody else to change. So that's one of the big issues with the kind of listening focus at the moment. We've got to seriously look in the mirror, all of us, not point at everybody else that's rubbish at it.
Yeah.
And the second thing we notice, and this links into the activism work, is that we've had lots of leaders offering invitations for people to speak up, and a really popular one is bring your whole selves to work. We're listening.
Yeah.
Please do that. And then, of course, some employees, particularly in some parts of the world, in some industries more than others, hear this invitation. They kind of go, oh, thank you very much. I will speak up then. Since you say you're listening, so let's talk about race.
Yeah.
Let's talk about gender. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about modern slavery, because you've just said you're listening. You want me to speak up and bring my whole self to work. Here we go. Let's talk. And a lot of leaders and managers are kind of slightly stunned at that point, and they go, oh, I kind of was just wanting your ideas and good compliance.
Not like
that. Wasn't really. So when we say listening, it's political.
Yeah.
We need to take that phrase really seriously.
Yeah.
And it's a big mistake is when organizations think that they can kind of say, speak up, we're listening. Oh, not about that.
Not that,
Yeah, we'll talk about that, but we won't talk about that because that's political, and we're apolitical, or we're neutral, or that's not business. Yeah. All of this is fraught with problems. So do I think it's a fad? Yes, in the sense that I don't think people generally know what they're letting themselves in for when they do it.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a fad because I'm afraid I've been through the mindfulness, you might say fad.
Yeah.
These are serious capacities for our organizations, but many organizations are so focused on the new shiny thing that in order to instigate any form of cultural change, I'm afraid it's fairly boring.
Yeah.
You have to persist, you have to have patience, and you have to prioritize and stick with it.
Yeah.
And that isn't sexy.
No.
That's not when people are thinking about their next conference, it's like, oh, but we want to talk about something new.
Yeah.
So there's an issue generally.
Yeah.
But is it fabulous underneath all of that?
Yeah.
Is it one of the bedrocks of how our organizations perform and how we are able to fulfill ourselves or not? Absolutely.
Yeah. That made me think about all sorts of things that are, I guess, intrinsic to us as human beings, and they matter to us. And we like the fact that perhaps we can externalize those, and people go, yes, they matter to me as well, because there's a validation there, right? I'm not alone. There are others who believe, and that feels like it could then become something you could attach to and be part of. But then when that gets pushed aside as like, no, not that way, then people are like, well, what's going on here? There's a confusing signal there, isn't there, for people? And then we wonder about loyalty and go, why aren't people more loyal? It's like, well, what are you giving them to be loyal about and to? And there is something in my mind, I think, about the word value, because that kind of has two connotations, I think, in the topic that you're leading us down here, which is the value the organization's there to create, right? Service to the world, products that make a difference, whatever it is. But what I value in life as an individual is a different kind of value. But I'm bringing that to help you create that value. And you're telling me that's not valuable to you because you don't want to listen. That incongruency that maybe explains why the Gallup poll recently showed such low levels of engagement. Whether that's the real thing or not, we don't know. But there's a puzzle in my mind of just how this is a cross wires kind of conversation.
Well, certainly so we've got organizations that are asking people to speak up more at the same time as we've got organizations making some pretty large pronouncements about purpose and values that people are listening to at the same time as you've got an increase in use and quality of technology that enables people to collectively speak and join together with one another, at the same time as you've got governments and trade unions as well that have gone down in terms of level of trust, and people are thinking, well, this issue is important to me, but I'm not sure that those institutions that previously I've relied on are the ones to instigate change. So all of these factors, as well as a new generation, of course, that of course they're focused on some of these social and environmental issues because they're the generation that have to clean up the mess. So we've got all of this sort of constellation of factors inside our organizations.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things that we see very often is what we call facadism,
Yeah.
which is leaders and marketing materials
Yeah.
saying that something is important.
Yeah.
And so people join the organization on the back of that.
Yep.
Or employees kind of sit up and take notice and they think, right,
Yeah.
okay. And then nothing happens.
Yeah.
And that's either because nothing was ever going to happen, because it literally is a kind of marketing slogan and nothing else. There was no intention.
Yeah.
Or very often there is an intention, but frankly, again, we're so pathologically busy that we're so focused on short-term targets that we haven't got round to doing the kind of stuff that we said we would. And you know, it doesn't take very long for employees and our other stakeholders, our customers, and our investors to sit up and go, wait a second, you made that claim and you're not following up on it.
Yeah.
So where is that incongruence and what does that mean? And, you know, I think some organisations are more in the firing line on that than others.
True. And I suppose we are in an age where we've been seduced by hyperbole, but now actually perhaps there's a backlash to that, which is like, I want to see that quickly then. And if I don't see that quickly, I don't trust you. I don't believe it because it's just going to dissipate and it's more vacuous sloganeering, as you said. And I do want to come back to the whole sense, actually, that purpose as a thing has been kind of hijacked. But equally, there's something where we can see some organisations really do live it. You know, Patagonia make big declarations, but they do what they say, don't they? So are you identifying some who at least are some way nearer to that and more altruistic, perhaps, and honest and follow through? Are you finding any of those in your research, or is that what you're going to look for?
Yes, we have. I mean, we identified a kind of spectrum of different organisations or leaders, actually. It can be looked at as individual leaders as well, because, of course, within an organisation, you can have some leaders that are activists, you know, strongly activists, and some leaders that are desperately trying to suppress it. So this taxonomy goes from everything from organisations where it's non-existent, there are no conversations around this, through to organisations whose strategy is to suppress voice, either by, you know, threatening and making employees fearful if they speak up about certain things, or by stipulating and saying, no, we're not going to talk about that here, which is an interesting strategy and one doomed to failure, if you ask me. A last Harvard Business Review article was called Don't Ban Politics at Work.
Oh, yeah.
Not because of what it sounds, it's just impossible to ban politics at work. And then there's organisations that do the facade that I've spoken about, organisations that do what we call defensive engagement, which is like, we'll make a stand, but only because we have to, actually, because the lawyers have told us that we've got to. Then there's dialogic engagement, and that's an interesting one on, I'm sure we'll come back to this, what does dialogue actually mean? And then you've got the stimulating activism, you've got the Patagonias, you've got the Ben and Jerry's, that are activist identity, that, you know, organizations. And the thing is, it's as risky to be at that end of the spectrum as it is to be the other end of the spectrum, in terms of if you make a stand, there's fallout. There's going to be consequences of doing that. But if you don't make a stand, there's also fallout.
Oh, totally.
So it's just understanding what are some of the consequences and having, again, these spaces to pause and go, where are we on this? Let's not just tumble into this and start trying to, you know, react to the latest thing that's come up in the news, sort of slightly panicked. Where are we as an organisation? Where am I as a leader on this spectrum? What counts? What do I want to make a stand on? What will I have to choose not to make a stand on, because we can't take a stand on everything?
And scandals are everywhere, aren't they? It's almost a weekly occurrence that there is some corporate scandal or another. PwC in Australia with tax, McDonald's and sexual harassment, and the CBI and their kind of implosion, I suppose you'd say, around that. And so I guess we are looking around going, wow, you are literally just one thing away from complete collapse. So the damage is definitely there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, I remember a few features last year, I think particularly, having a go at organisations that were B Corps. And you know, my little outfit's one, and I took great umbrage at that. I'm like, how very dare you? But then I'm like, hang on a minute. It is still something that could be like gamed and manipulated. So I think there's a lot of, as you rightly put it, the sort of facadism which is going on in some respects, and I'm sensing that there is this. If activism plays a really strong part in that dialogue, which we can come back to, there's a more sense-checking thing going on that keeps it on the right side of genuine. Is that almost like a hypothesis you're testing? The more activism there is, the more likely you are to do the right thing?
That's just fraught with issues of subjectivity there.
Okay.
What the hell is the right thing?
Yeah.
So, you know, and we have activists in either direction.
True.
on pretty much
point.
Everything. So I think it's incredibly problematic to say, is this good or bad, or who's good or bad, because of course it depends on your view of activism in the first place, which is something I should mention actually for the people listening here. As soon as we mentioned the word activism, probably there was some sort of response if you're listening. And we may have had some listeners that are kind of like, oh, this is really interesting. Love it. Oh, yeah. This bit's for me. And we'll have had some listeners going, oh, for goodness sake, does everything have to be so woke? Are we really going into that territory? Come on, Perry. So one of the things that we say in our research is the first step is like, when I say the word activism, what comes to your mind?
Yeah, good point.
You know, what images, what emotions, what words do you associate with this and why? Because that is, if you're in a leadership or management role or in an activist role, that is going to determine your response into the system. You know, how do you view yourself as an activist? How do you view others? And we had one time where I was facilitating a board in a retail group, and in the coffee break they were talking about one of the employees who had, on the Slack channel, had kind of been rather vocal about the climate change credentials. And, you know, some people around that table wanted to bring him in to educate everybody, and some people on the table basically wanted to get rid of him.
Wow.
So, you know, we have to go back to that point before we look at, you know, whether it's good or whether it's bad. It's very, very, very controversial.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I'm glad I kind of dropped that in because you have got constructive activism and destructive activism, I suppose, again, depending on your perspective of what you're destroying and what you're constructing. Ooh, that makes it a really nice mind meld, but maybe doesn't make it any easier for you to do the research on.
It's not easy research. Well, it's incredibly interesting because there's no answer. There's no solution.
Right.
So, which is obviously very problematic when you get to talking to leaders and managers typically want to know, well, what are the steps? And of course we have that, but it's really important to remember that subjectivity and the way that we construct these terms in the first place. And Ruchika Tulsian, who's author of Inclusion on Purpose, we interviewed her and she said, I loved this phrase, she said, what looks like rebellion to you might be another person's basic human rights. And that's what we're facing in organizations. It's like there is all of these difference of viewpoints and perspectives. And and we know from our wider research on speaking truth to power, the more senior you are, the more male, the more white you are, the more you will think that people around you are speaking up. You'll think that you're approachable. You'll think that you're good at listening. Therefore, you'll think you have your finger on the pulse when you probably don't.
Right.
And we call that advantage blindness. You know, when you have those advantage titles and labels, your experience of the world is obviously very different from other people in the organization. So how do you first of all burst that little bubble where you think you think you've got your finger on the pulse, and then do you have the courage, I suppose, to invite in some of those other voices? And a big question is, why would you? Well, there's all sorts of responses to that.
And brings us back perhaps to the nature of dialogue and the reason we have it, and how you're perhaps hoping to spotlight some of that so that we can see people not fall into their own traps, or their own advantage blindness kind of stops them from asking the right questions and getting the right things going on. And again, I use the word right for circumstance in that particular sense. So yeah, I mean, unpack that a little bit. Tell me more a bit about that sort of dialogic sort of frame of reference that you have in your mind, and or that plays a part in this.
So when we use dialogue, and when I hear it used in leadership or management settings, it kind of very often conjures up this sort of slight picture of people with a nice cup of tea having a good chat. We're in dialogue. Yep. Again, we know from our research, when you ask an organization what is the leadership or organizational response to activism, the more senior you are, the more likely it is that you'll say that you're in dialogue.
Okay.
The more junior you are, the more likely, or if you don't have those advantage titles, you're much more likely to kind of go, I don't call that dialogue. Yeah. So the first thing I would say about dialogue is it's intimately bound with power. Right. And how we come to understand power. Yeah. And as is all speaking up and listening up in our organizations. So we are very interested on the titles and labels that convey status and authority, because that underpins the sort of whole architecture, if you like, of whose voices get heard and what subjects get talked about. And very often we're busy over here and we try and do, have dialogues without really identifying it and acknowledging the fact that power, status, and authority will define people's capacity to speak up and certainly define their capacity to be heard. We only listen to certain voices. So dialogue, I suppose, is where people come in and share information in an environment where people feel psychologically safe to do that, to share information and challenge, and very often share decision-making. And that's the bit that makes dialogue even more tricky. It's like, okay, if you're inviting people around the table, are you willing to share the choices and the decision-making that comes out of it? And that brings me on to one of the sorry if I sound slightly excited at this stage, I'm a leadership professor. I've looked at leadership for a long period of time, and we are at such an interesting stage in it because this is a complete generalization now, but generally for the last 5 decades at business schools, we've been teaching leaders to know the answer, have the vision, communicate amazingly well, so that everybody agrees with you and does what you say. That's I'm obviously being slightly flippant, but that is the way that we've seen leadership, and it's still a good skill to have, by the way. But of course, bring in what's our stance on race? What's our stance on climate? What are we willing to do in terms of an organization on sustainability? How do we tackle gender sorts of issues and inequity in our organizations? What do we do about our supply chain? These are wicked problems. They don't have, there is not a leader in a position that knows the answer. If they think they do, they are seriously deluded. So how do you kind of then, as a leader, see your blind spots, understand that your perspective is partial, and then, get this, encourage people to disagree with you. I mean, how countercultural and intuitive is that? But that's what dialogue is, really. You're enabling people to have a different perspective from you, and you're open and listening to it. And I don't know, I find that bloody hard. I find that really difficult to really step into that place. So how do we do that in our systems where we still think of leaders as kind of this should be this perfect, know, all-knowing being that doesn't put a foot wrong? There's no way you're going to go into dialogue without messing up, saying the wrong thing, getting fallout. And that, so our understanding of what good leadership is has to alter. And I think it is, but slowly.
Hey folks, Perry Timms here, host of Tomorrow's People. I have to tell you that I'm loving Personio. It's a game changer for HR. With fantastic features and new updates coming all of the time, it keeps your HR work innovative almost on its own. Check them out at personio.com. That's personio.com. And it does talk to the reason that we see so many different perspectives on leadership now that perhaps we didn't do as much before. Compassion, which was perhaps a very strong leading element to leadership during the pandemic. Yes, you care. Yes, you spoke to me. Yes, I know this is going on. Because there was almost like a please rescue us leader type feel.
Yeah.
And please recognise I'm having a hard time leader feel.
Yeah.
So you had to be both hero and nurture, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was when a lot of people kind of went, oh, hang on a minute, this leadership thing has turned into something very much more complex and multifaceted perhaps than before. And then you've just given us a whole raft of others and you haven't even mentioned generative AI yet. You know, these things are coming in where leaders are like, how on earth am I supposed to know what to do with that? And there is something about but I'm expected to, aren't I? Because all of these people are looking at me to do that. And what if I then turn around and say, no, I don't know what I'm going to do? And the vote of confidence goes down and we all go into chaos. Yeah. They feel like they're holding it together because it's almost like, well, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah. So John is my research partner, John Higgins. Yeah. We refer to it as the impossible agenda.
Impossible agenda,
It gets more and more impossible as years go past. Yeah. We don't tend to take anything off the agenda. True. We just keep adding. And so what do you do in that situation is a very good question. Yeah. And, you know, some of the... some things that we've said for a long time in terms of who do you have around you, who's in your group of people who you go to, who you seek opinions and advice from. That's problematic, by the way, because most leaders we've researched have quite a small group of people that they draw on, and so they end up in echo chambers, which creates more of an issue. But if you've got an impossible agenda, whose voices are around you? How do you get people to disagree with you and point out your blind spots, even though they really won't do that unless you make it very easy for them to do so? And how do you balance that kind of... Well, in activist terms, we draw on a phrase by Mayerson and Scully, who are two academics, who use the phrase tempered radical. Okay. Which I adore. Yeah, I like in activism, you kind of like, you have to be radical to make a change. But if you're too radical, of course, you get spat out of the system, so you temper it. As a leader, you have to kind of be open and authentic and say, I've no idea. This is hell. You know, what do I do? But if you do that too much, you probably will have a fairly short shelf life. So how do you also... You know, you are holding the space for people. You are creating a safe space also. So it's this sort of tightrope that you're balancing act that you're walking. And the only thing, you know, and I'm biased with this, but the only other thing I would say is, therefore, as a leader or a manager, please make sure you have some pauses and some spaces where you get to kind of go, what am I doing? Am I doing this right? What impact am I having? And is that impact the impact that I really want to have? And so few leaders and managers seem to be in a position where they have the space to reflect and think. And that's when we really are getting into trouble.
That impossible agenda is a really nice way to keep a frame of that in mind, because I'm sure there are a lot of people going, I thought I was pretty okay at this leadership thing. Now I don't know. And I feel like I'm just faffing around. Faffing is a word I like a lot, by the way. However, what I think you've now hit on there is two brilliant ways of looking at the word space. And leadership may be less as an individual and as a space that individuals share. That's what I heard you talk about there. Now, a good friend of mine who used to work at the World Economic Forum did a TEDx talk, Vijay Raju, and he said leadership is a space. And I thought, God, I've never thought about it like that before. That's brilliant. And I think more and more I'm hearing this collective sense of people being able to add, augment, situationally step in, and so on. So I quite like that feel, though, because the hero figure thing just feels like it's just had its day.
Yeah, I agree. And so we looked at dialogue as part of our Speaking Truth to Power as one of we created these sort of 4 different truth power cultures, if you like, and dialogue was one of them, where there are multiple truths, if you see what I mean, and power is shared. It's power with others. And the advantages, of course, is that you get to see the world and you have so much more data available to you to make wise choices. The disadvantage, of course, can be, how do you make a bloody decision? So it's there is a role of how do I create the spaces? How do I convene the people? And there is and when do we call it? And there'll be fallouts. There will be, how do you then deal with the fallout? And then when you've made a choice or a decision, how do you kind of also stay open to that decision changing? So it's a very tricky space to be in.
And my mind went back to the whole sense that decisions get made at boards anyway, and people go off and interpret them how they like, and some don't even bother. And it's almost like, well, if it didn't work in that way, how and why would it work in a slightly more chaotic but still tempered space? But and that's the other space, is the one that you hit on right at the start of this, which is we have got to give ourselves much more thinking space. And how do you do that? Well, maybe there is this habits thing that you talked about and discipline, but there's also got to be a shift in that we value that space. That has a value. And I don't know whether that's something that you've started to explore, almost like, how do you get people to really want that space?
I think we are exploring that, absolutely. Okay. So years ago, when I did a doctorate on dialogue in organizations, and one of the big themes that came out of that was worthwhileness. Ooh. So we are, when we gather people together in a meeting, there's this undercurrent of this had better be worthwhile. As a facilitator as well, you'll recognize this. You kind of gather people together, or as a coach, you bring someone and you think, well, this person had better think it's worthwhile at the end of this. And then that drives so much of our behavior. And again, we've got to be able to value space that is not so strict and short-term and tangible. And yet we are in bigger systems where that is really pushed and focused on. So this is one of my wicked questions, is how do we start to recognize the value of that space? And it is partly through experience, and it's through some courageous steps by us as individuals and our leaders and managers to create the spaces and keep creating them. Anything that's countercultural is courageous and risks you being, shot out of the system. And so I see people that are trying to create these spaces. It is quite a courageous act. But when they are given a chance, of course, people are like, oh my goodness, that's so valuable.
And passes the worthwhileness test. I really like that, so I'm going to use that. Thank you very much. Now, I know a little bit about Robert Keegan's work on adult development theory. And what he says is being an adult is not just simply adding to the vessel of your mind, right? It's not just how much more do we know. And I'm feeling the sense that actually, if you tried to teach people in your role as a professor and they said, what's on the curriculum then? You're like, we're going to teach you how to make some thinking space. They'll be like, Megan, what on earth are you selling me here? because it's counterintuitive, as you said.
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation I had with the head of talent at a big communications company about 2 or 3 years ago. And I think this is where the whole spaciousness thing started. In conversation, he said to me, essentially, right, Megan, if you were me, if you were setting the agenda, the leadership development agenda now for the next year or so, what would you put on the curriculum? And I found myself saying, because I really hadn't thought of it in those terms before, I found myself saying, you know what? A lot of the leaders and managers that end up in the classroom that I'm in, they know a lot of this. They do know about listening. They do know about, speaking up. They do know a lot, actually. Not all of them, but a lot of them know what's important to them. They know how to be with other people, but they don't have the space to remember it.
Oh.
They don't. So rather than, I don't know, sometimes I see these curriculums of, we'll do a few hours on listening, we'll do a few hours on empathy, we'll do a few hours on purpose, and we'll teach you stuff. And that is valid and that is relevant. But again, most of the people, this in coaching, non-directive coaching as well, people know it. They just don't have space to remember it and then make the choices that action what they've remembered. And of course, there's a role for teaching and skills and framing things in ways that people find useful and helpful. Yeah. But there is absolutely a role to create the spaces where people look inside themselves and with others and go, wow, this is actually what we need to do.
Yeah. One of the episodes in this series will look at uniqueness. And I think there is something in that, isn't there? We have almost like a what kind of leader am I? Almost like a position on a field of play in a sport. Not what, but who am I? And what matters to me, and how do I manifest that? And when do I know there's the incongruency that I'm just like, I'm not doing that, versus I've been compromised by that because I've got to do that for the role. That's going on all the time. But again, it isn't getting the space and the thought process going.
Not at all.
And then we wonder why there are scandals.
Well, and usually organisations end up on the front page of the newspaper because somebody has spoken up, but they haven't been heard, or they've felt unable to speak up. Yeah. And normally we see the newspaper with the kind of end of the story when people have walked out or been fired or whatever or boycotted. Yeah. But there's a long story of somebody or some people trying to have conversations before that ends up being in the position that it is. And, so how do we, one of our big questions has been, how do we stay in touch? How do we know what employees really care about and what their experiences are? How do we listen to that?
And I've worked in the energy sector where at 10 o'clock, everybody stops. There's a safety briefing, whether you're in a comfortable office or whether you're out in the field or up a pole. And it's almost like, is that part of the habit thing that we need? Some, not quite safety briefings, but almost that mentality to punctuate the busyness and the pathology of it.
Yeah, I've also worked in one of the big energy companies as a management consultant, and I was blown away by the rigor of the safety briefing. I mean, I couldn't believe it. Yeah. And yes, that starts to change habits when it just is there the whole time. Yeah. One thing that I'm interested in, for example, going back to the mindfulness work, is what would it be like if when we meet together, we pause at the beginning of that meeting or halfway through that meeting for literally a minute. And I've recorded I collaborate with the app Calm. Yeah. And I've recorded some pre-meeting meditations that some of which are used on Zoom because that Calm is collaborating with Zoom. And what would it be? Is it rather than rush into a meeting, a few minutes late, still thinking about the meeting that we've just been to, and therefore really not landing and not showing up in a way that is helpful to other people around the table. What would it be like if we just paused and we just noticed? And all I do is I take people through what's in your mind right now. What's it like up there?
Yeah.
Just notice. You don't even need to change anything.
Yeah.
Just notice.
Yeah.
Notice how you are.
Yeah.
Like, what emotional state are you bringing into this room? And notice how your body is landing. What are the physical sensations right here and now? Yeah. And it's amazing what 1 minute will do to the capacity for people to show up well. And then actually the 90-second version says to people, what impact do you want to make in the next half an hour? Yeah. And people turn their attention to it. And of course, what we pay attention to defines our lives as well as the lives of people around us. So if we have those spaces where we can turn our attention to the things that really matter to us, that charts our path a lot better than if we're on autopilot and literally reacting to everything that's thrown at us during the day.
I feel remarkably calmed by that, genuinely, because I went through as you did that, but my reaction to what do I want to get out of this is just so lacking in the transactional to and fro of it all. But I have seen it in one very large corporate in this company. And it completely changes the dynamic of the space that people are then in. So again, the space that you create for yourself, and I love the fact that you invite people to just know what's going on up in the head. No rationalize, just know, just be aware of it, because I think it does stop some of that autopilot stuff that we just get so caught up by. And just the thoughtfulness of it just made me remind myself about all the things that matter to you at that point in time are what's important. So yeah, that's lovely. I mean, that's a lovely invitation for people listening to this to actually now do. So we'll pause there and let you do that. So impossible agendas, big things we've been talking about, climate and psychodynamics and so on. I'm hoping lots of people are as excited about your research and what this is leading to and what we can potentially start doing now. But are there a few takeaways and things that you are aware of that actually people can go, hey, yeah, I could try that. I could build that in. I could do that. Anything come to mind?
Yes. So a lot of our work is how do you show up in a way that helps other people to voice. Yep. I want to mention one little story again, which people might be familiar with if they've heard me talk before. I had a very impactful interview last year with someone called Ian Wilkie, who is the founder of an organization called 50 Million Voices. 50 Million Voices is an organization that seeks to support, about 50 million adults across the globe who stutter. So they have a stammer. And Ian, who stammers, in our interview, he said to me, essentially, Megan, how you show up, how you're showing up right now with me affects my voice. So if you show up and you're distracted or you're doing your emails, if I think that you're judging me, whether you are or not, but you're sending signals that you're judging me, or I will literally lose my voice. And I thought that was, it's an amazing metaphor for leadership. Actually, and for all of us, wherever we are in our organizations, how we show up, and at home, by the way, how we show up affects the voices of the people around us. It affects what we get to hear. Yeah. So in terms of where our focus is at, we try and help leaders to show up in a way that enables them to hear what they need to hear. Yeah. So one thing we look at is, first of all, enabling leaders to realize that they're scarier than they think. Okay? Yeah. So because they have the titles and labels that convey status and authority, even if they're lovely, people will find them intimidating. Our very first Harvard Business Review article was called "The Problem with Saying My Door is Always Open."
Oh, yeah.
Which it's not a problem to say my door is always open. It's a problem if you think anybody will necessarily come through the door because you're scary. So this is the first thing. It's to really understand who might be intimidated by me. Even if I don't feel powerful, even if I think I'm lovely, who will still find me intimidating? And how can I pay attention to that? And meet them in an environment and a context where it puts them at ease. Okay, you'll never get rid of power. You can't leave titles at the door, but you can begin to minimize that. So that's one thing.
Nice.
So the question for people listening is, who might find you a bit intimidating? Second thing is, we have these little lists of people that we listen to, that we seek opinions from. And then we kind of have a list of people that we don't hear from. And as leaders and managers, we need to check, am I in an echo chamber? I mentioned this earlier. Do I turn to people that look and sound an awful lot like me? And whose voices am I not hearing, and what's the consequences of that? So how do I reach out to hear different voices? So that's the second thing we work on. And again, for people listening, might you be in a bit of an echo chamber? If there was other voices, if there was another voice that you needed to hear more from, what would it be?
Cool.
And then the third one is about the signals that we send. So we send signals all the time that help others to speak or close them down. And actually, we do need both. We do sometimes need to close people down rather than... You'll probably need to close me down soon, Perry, otherwise I'll go on talking forever, you see.
It's coming.
So the thing is, do we know what signals we're sending when? And, the classic is on Teams or Zoom and the way that all of us, for some reason, think that we can do our emails subtly without anybody else noticing, but it's always obvious.
Totally obvious.
So, if you're doing that as the manager and people are thinking about talking to you, they're going to see that you're not there and they won't speak. So can we be aware of the signals that we send that either help people to speak or close them down, particularly, and I'll stop after this, particularly when somebody has spoken up. So somebody's spoken up, they've offered an idea and maybe it's not a great one, or they've disagreed with us or challenged us. The signals that we send in the next few seconds create the story in people's minds about whether they're going to do that again. It defines whether they'll speak up again, and probably the colleagues that are listening in. So how do we respond in a way that enables other people to feel safe to speak up, and to speak up in a way that's that they can be heard? We can still, it doesn't mean opening the doors to everybody all the time. I'm often mistaken for saying that. I'm not saying that, but how do we respond in a way that people feel valued, but they also learn perhaps, right, next time I speak up, I need to kind of do it this way, or, actually, this isn't the place to do that. It's there. So how do we help people through every single response that we have? That would be something to pay attention to.
What a lovely invitation. There are sort of nanosecond trails in what you just said, where there's this, you have a reaction, but you're not even aware of it. And then you have a reaction and you're aware of it, but it's still an involuntary reaction. And then there's this nanosecond after that where you're like, but is that going to help? What's going on here? And it's that crucial point, isn't it? Because you can't help that involuntary reaction, but you can help when you know about it, what you do. I love that invitation. That's so crucial for people to be aware of and have the space up here to know what's going on. Because we read clues from each other all the time, don't we? Whether it's on screen, in person, even just the tone of voice if we're on a voice-only call. And we're missing out on so much rich interpretive ways to be. Oh, what a lovely way to end that. I thought that was so like uber practical, but also incredibly profound, like a lot of the things that you must come across are. It's like, but it's so simple, but that means actually it is really profound because it's not happening enough now.
In a nutshell, if we could just be more aware and pay more attention to how we show up, that would help how others show up.
That's massively critical, isn't it? Wow. So I will put some contact details in the review of the show afterwards, Megan. But I suspect a lot of people listening to this are going to be tagging themselves to follow what comes from this research that you've got, both a decade of and now its current shape and form, because I kind of lost myself in that conversation. So if I was a rubbish host, it was only because I was just completely absorbed. So
and that's why you were absolutely not a rubbish host, is because we're sitting here. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this face-to-face as well. We see one another, we show up, and that then affects our voices. So thank you for helping my voice.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Tomorrow's People, please subscribe and check out our previous episodes from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you want to transform your people processes, head to personio.com.